Chapter 2.4 Symptoms of Passage. Quote, "Here then is the man outside our people, outside our humanity. He is continually starving, nothing belongs to him but the prolonged instant of torture. He always has only one thing, his suffering, but there is nothing on the entire face of the earth that could serve as a remedy for him. There is no ground on which to plant his 2 feet, no support for his 2 hands to grasp, and thus there is so much less for him than there is for the music hall trapeze artist who is at least hanging by a thread." End quote, by Franz Kafka. The end of colonialism and the declining powers of the nation are indicative of a general passage from the paradigm of modern sovereignty toward the paradigm of imperial sovereignty. The various postmodernist and postcolonialist theories that have emerged since the 1980s give us a first view of this passage, but the perspective they offer proves to be quite limited. As the prefix post should indicate, postmodernist and postcolonialist theorists never tire of critiquing and seeking liberation from the past forms of rule and their legacies in the present. Postmodernists continually return to the lingering influence of the Enlightenment as a source of domination. Postcolonialist theorists combat the remnants of colonialist thinking. We suspect that postmodernist and postcolonialist theories may end up in a dead end because they fail to recognize adequately the contemporary object of critique. That is, they mistake today's real enemy. What if the modern form of power these critics, and we ourselves, have taken such pains to describe and contest, no longer holds sway in our society? What if these theorists are so intent on combating the remnants of a past form of domination that they fail to recognize a new form that is looming over them in the present? What if the dominating powers that are the intended object of critique have mutated in such a way as to depotentialize any such postmodernist challenge? In short, what if a new paradigm of power, a postmodern sovereignty, has come to replace the modern paradigm and rule through differential hierarchies of the hybrid and fragmentary subjectivities that these theorists celebrate? In this case, modern forms of sovereignty would no longer be at issue, and the postmodernist and postcolonialist strategies that appear to be liberatory would not challenge, but in fact coincide with, and even unwittingly reinforce, the new strategies of rule. When we begin to consider the ideologies of corporate capital in the world market, it certainly appears that the postmodernist and postcolonialist theorists who advocated politics of difference, fluidity, and hybridity in order to challenge the binaries and essentialism of modern sovereignty have been outflanked by the strategies of power. Power has evacuated the bastion they are attacking and has circled around to their rear to join them in the assault in the name of difference. These theorists thus find themselves pushing against an open door. We do not mean to suggest that postmodernist and or postcolonialist theorists are somehow the lackeys of global capital in the world market. Anthony Appiah and Arif Derlich are ungenerous when they cast these authors in the position of a comprator intelligentsia and the intelligentsia of global capitalism. There is no need to doubt the democratic, egalitarian, and even at times anti-capitalist desires that motivate large segments of these fields of work. But it is important to investigate the utility of these theories in the context of the new paradigm of power. This new enemy is not only resistant to the old weapons, but actually thrives on them, and thus joins its would-be antagonists in applying them to the fullest. Long live difference, down with essentialist binaries. To a certain extent, postmodernist and postcolonialist theories are important effects that reflect or trace the expansion of the world market and the passage of the form of sovereignty. These theories point toward empire, but in a vague and confused way, with no awareness of the paradigmatic leap that this passage constitutes. We have to delve deep into this passage, elaborate its terms, and make clear the lineaments that constitute the new empire. Recognizing the value and limitations of postmodernist and postcolonialist theories is a first step in this project. Politics of difference. In order to appreciate fully the critical powers of postmodernist discourses, one must first focus on the modern forms of sovereignty. As we saw in the previous sections, the world of modern sovereignty is a Manichaean world, divided by a series of binary oppositions that define self and other, white and black, inside and out, ruler and ruled. Postmodernist thought challenges precisely this binary logic of modernity, and in this respect provides important resources for those who are struggling to challenge modern discourses of patriarchy, colonialism, and racism. In the context of postmodernist theories, the hybridity and ambivalence of our cultures and our senses of belonging seem to challenge the binary logic of self and other that stands behind modern colonialist, sexist, and racist constructions. Similarly, the postmodernist insistence on difference and specificity defies the totalitarianism of universalizing discourses and structures of power. The affirmation of fragmented social identities appears as a means of contesting the sovereignty of both the modern subject and the modern nation-state, along with all hierarchies they imply. This postmodernist critical sensibility is extremely important in this regard because it constitutes a proposition or the symptom of a break with respect to the entire development of modern sovereignty. It is difficult to generalize about the numerous discourses that go under the banner of postmodernism, but most of them draw at least indirectly on Jean-Francois Lyotard's critique of modernist master narratives, Jean Baudrillard's affirmations of cultural simulacra, or Jacques Derrida's critique of Western metaphysics. In the most basic and reductive formulation, postmodernist theories are defined by many of their proponents as sharing one single common denominator, a generalized attack on the Enlightenment. From this perspective, the call to action is clear. Enlightenment is the problem, and postmodernism is the solution. We should take care, however, to look more closely at what exactly is intended by Enlightenment, or modernity, from this postmodernist perspective. We argued earlier that modernity should be understood not as uniform and homogeneous, but rather as constituted by at least two distinct and conflicting traditions. The first tradition is that initiated by the revolution of Renaissance humanism, from Duns Scotus to Spinoza, with the discovery of the place of immanence and the celebration of singularity and difference. The second tradition, the Thermidor of the Renaissance Revolution, seeks to control the utopian forces of the first through the construction and mediation of dualisms, and arrives finally at the concept of modern sovereignty as a provisional solution. When modernists propose their opposition to a modernity and an enlightenment that exalts the universality of reason only to sustain a white male European supremacy, it should be clear that they are really attacking the second tradition of our schema, and unfortunately ignoring or eclipsing the first. It will be more accurate, in other words, to pose postmodernist theory as a challenge neither to the Enlightenment nor to modernity in toto, but specifically to the tradition of modern sovereignty. More precisely still, these various theoretical contestations are brought together most coherently in a challenge to the dialectic as a central logic of modern domination, exclusion, and command. For both its relegating the multiplicity of difference to binary oppositions and its subsequent assumption of these differences in a unitary order. If modern power itself is dialectical, the logic goes, then the postmodernist project must be non-dialectical. Once we recognize postmodernist discourses as an attack on the dialectical form of modern sovereignty, then we can see more clearly how they contest systems of domination such as racism and sexism by deconstructing the boundaries that maintain the hierarchies between white and black, masculine and feminine, and so forth. This is how postmodernists can conceive their theoretical practice as heir to an entire spectrum of modern and contemporary liberation struggles. The history of challenges to European political economic hegemony and its colonial role, the successes of national liberation movements, women's movements, and anti-racist struggles are all interpreted as a heritage of postmodernist politics because they, too, aim at disrupting the order and the dualisms of modern sovereignty. If the modern is a field of power of the white, the male, and the European, then in perfectly symmetrical fashion, the postmodern will be the field of liberation of the non-white, non-male, and the non-European. As Bell Hooks says, in its best form, radical postmodernist practice, a politics of difference, incorporates the values and voices of the displaced, the marginalized, the exploited, and the oppressed. The binaries and dualisms of modern sovereignty are not disrupted only to establish new ones. Rather, the very power of binaries is dissolved as we set differences to play across boundaries. Postmodernist thinking has been received by a wide range of scholars as a clarion call to a new paradigm of academic and intellectual practice, and as a real opportunity to dislodge the dominant paradigms of scholarship in their own field. One of the most important examples from our perspective is a postmodernist challenge in the field of international relations. Here, the modernist paradigm of research is more or less identified with the methods of realism and neorealism, and thus centered on the concept of sovereignty, commonly understood as synonymous with the power of nation-states, the legitimate use of state violence, and territorial integrity. From a postmodernist perspective, this modernist international relations, because of its acceptance of and focus on these boundaries, tends to support the dominant power and the sovereignty of nation-states. Authors in this field thus make a clear connection between the critique of the binary dualisms of the Enlightenment developed in the context of the philosophical and literary postmodernists and the challenge to the fixed boundaries of modern state sovereignty. Postmodernist international relations theorists strive to challenge the sovereignty of states by deconstructing the boundaries of the ruling powers, highlighting irregular and uncontrolled international movements and flows, and thus fracturing stable unities and oppositions. Discourse and interpretation are presented as powerful weapons against the institutional rigidities of the modernist perspectives. The resulting postmodernist analyses point toward the possibility of a global politics of difference, a politics of deterritorialized flows across a smooth world, free of the rigid striation of state boundaries. Although many of the various postmodernist theorists are lucid in their refusal of the logics of modern sovereignty, they are in general extremely confused with the nature of our potential liberation from it, perhaps precisely because they cannot recognize clearly the forms of power that have today come to supplant it. When they present their theories as part of a project of political liberation, in other words, postmodernists are still waging battle against the shadows of old enemies, the Enlightenment, or really, modern forms of sovereignty and its binary reductions of difference and multiplicity to a single alternative between same and other. The affirmation of hybridities and the free play of differences across boundaries, however, is liberatory only in a context where power poses hierarchy exclusively through essential identities, binary divisions, and stable oppositions. The structures and logics of power in the contemporary world are entirely immune to the liberatory weapons of the postmodernist politics of difference. In fact, Empire, too, is bent on doing away with those modern forms of sovereignty and on setting differences to play across boundaries. Despite the best intentions, then, the postmodernist politics of difference not only isn't effective against, but can even coincide with and support the functions and practices of imperial rule. The danger is that postmodernist theories focus their attention so resolutely on the old forms of power they are running from, with their heads turned backwards, that they tumble unwittingly into the welcoming arms of the new power. From this perspective, the celebratory affirmations of postmodernists can easily appear naive, when not purely mystifying. What we find most important in the various postmodernist currents of thought is the historical phenomenon they represent. They are the symptoms of eruption of the tradition of modern sovereignty. There is, of course, a long tradition of anti-modern thought that opposes modern sovereignty, including the great thinkers of the Frankfurt School, along with the entire Republican line we have traced back to Renaissance humanism. What is new, however, is that postmodernist theorists point to the end of modern sovereignty and demonstrate a new capacity to think outside the framework of modern binaries and modern identities, a thought of plurality and multiplicity. However confusedly or unconsciously, they indicate the passage towards the constitution of empire. The liberation of hybridities, or beyond colonial binaries. A certain stream of post-colonial studies also proposes a global politics of difference and might be well situated in line with postmodernist theory. Our analysis of modern sovereignty in the preceding sections poses already a strong potential rationale for an accord between post-colonialist and postmodernist theories. Insofar as modern sovereignty was identified with Europe's tendency toward global domination, and more important, insofar as colonial administration and imperialist practices were central components in the constitution of modern sovereignty, postmodernist and postcolonialist theories do indeed share a common enemy. Postmodernism appears in this light to be fundamentally post-Eurocentric. Postcolonial studies encompasses a wide and varied group of discourses, but we want to focus here on the work of Homi Bhabha, because it presents the clearest and best articulated example of the continuity between postmodernist and postcolonialist discourses. One of the primary and constant objects of Bobby's attack are binary divisions. In fact, the entire postcolonial project as he presents it is defined by its refusal of the binary divisions on which the colonialist worldview is predicated. The world is not divided in two and segmented in opposing camps, center versus periphery, first versus third world, but rather it is, and has always been, defined by innumerable partial and mobile differences. Bhabha's refusal to see the world in terms of binary divisions leads him to reject also theories of totality and theories of identity, homogeneity, and essentialism of social subjects. These various refusals are very closely linked. The binary conception of the world implies the essentialism and homogeneity of the identities on its two halves, and, through the relationship across that central boundary, implies the subsumption of all experience within a coherent social totality. In short, the specter that haunts Bhabha's analysis, and that coherently links together these various opponents, is the Hegelian dialectic. That is, the dialectic that subsumes, within a coherent totality, the essential social identities that face each other in opposition. In this sense, one could say that post-colonial theory, or at least this version of it, is, along with postmodernist theories, defined above all by its being non-dialectical. Bhabha's critique of the dialectic, that is, his attack on binary divisions, essential identities, and totalization, is both a sociological claim about the real nature of societies and a political project aimed at social change. The former is in fact a condition of possibility of the latter. Social identities and nations were never really coherent, imagined communities. The colonized mimicry of the colonizer's discourse rearticulates the whole notion of identity and alienates it from essence. Cultures are always already partial and hybrid formations. This social fact is the basis on which a subversive political project can be conducted to destroy the binary structure of power and identity. In summary form, then, Bhabha's logic of liberation runs like this. Power, or forces of social oppression, function by imposing binary structures and totalizing logics on social subjectivities, repressing their difference. These oppressive structures, however, are never total, and differences are always in some way expressed through mimicry, ambivalence, hybridization, fractured identities, and so forth. The post-colonial political project, then, is to affirm the multiplicity of differences so as to subvert the power of the ruling binary structures. The utopia Bhabha points toward after the binary and totalizing structures of power have been fractured and displaced is not an isolated and fragmentary existence, but a new form of community, a community of the unhomely, a new internationalism, a gathering of people in the diaspora. The affirmation of the difference and hybridity is itself, according to Bhabha, an affirmation of community. Quote, to live in the unhomely world, defined as ambivalences and ambiguities enacted in the house of fiction, or its sundering and splitting performed in the work of art, is also to affirm a profound desire for social solidarity. End quote. The seeds of the alternative community, he believes, arise out of close attention to the locality of culture, its hybridity, and its resistance to the binary structuring of social hierarchies. We should be careful to recognize the form of the dominating power that serves as the enemy, and really the negative foundation in this post-colonialist framework. Power is assumed to operate exclusively through a dialectical and binary structure. The only form of domination Bhabha recognizes, in other words, is that of modern sovereignty. This is why, for example, he can say hierarchical or binary as if the two terms were interchangeable. From his perspective, hierarchy as such is necessarily grounded in binary divisions, so that the mere fact of hybridity has the power to destroy hierarchy to court. Hybridity itself is a realized politics of difference, setting differences to play across boundaries. This is where the post-colonial and the postmodern most powerfully meet, in the united attack on the dialectics of modern sovereignty and the proposition of liberation as a politics of difference. Like the postmodernist theorists, post-colonial theorists such as Baba interest us primarily insofar as they are symptoms of the epochal shift we are undergoing, that is, the passage to empire. Perhaps the discourses themselves are possible only when the regimes of modern sovereignty are already on the wane. Like postmodernists too, however, post-colonialist theorists in general give a very confusing view of this passage because they remain fixated on attacking an old form of power and propose a strategy of liberation that could be effective only on that old terrain. The post-colonialist perspective remains primarily concerned with colonial sovereignty. As Gian Prakash says, quote, the post-colonial exists as an aftermath, as an after being worked over by colonialism, end quote. This may make post-colonialist theory a very productive tool for rereading history, but it is entirely insufficient for theorizing contemporary global power. Edward Said, certainly one of the most brilliant to go under the label of post-colonial theory, manages to condemn the current global power structures only to the extent that they perpetuate cultural and ideological remnants of European colonialist rule. He charges that, quote, the tactics of the great empires, that is, the European imperialisms, which were dismantled after the First World War, are being replaced by the U.S., end quote. What is missing here is the recognition of the novelty of the structures and logics of power that order the contemporary world. Empire is not a weak echo of modern imperialisms, but a fundamentally new form of rule. Fundamentalism and/or postmodernism. Another symptom of the historical passage already in process in the final decades of the 20th century is the rise of the so-called fundamentalisms. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the great ideologues of geopolitics and the theoreticians of the end of history have consistently posed fundamentalisms as a primary danger facing global order and stability. Fundamentalism, however, is a poor and confused category that groups together widely disparate phenomena. In general, one might say that fundamentalisms, diverse though they may be, are linked by their being understood both from within and outside as anti-modernist movements, resurgences of primordial identities and values. They are conceived as a kind of historical backflow, a demodernization. It is more accurate and more useful, however, to understand the various fundamentalism not as a recreation of a pre-modern world, but rather as a powerful refusal of the contemporary historical passage and course. In this sense, then, like postmodernist and post-colonialist theories, fundamentalisms too are a symptom of the passage to empire. Often today in the media, the term fundamentalism reduces the variety of social formations that go by that name and refers exclusively to Islamic fundamentalism, the complexity of which is in turn reduced to a violent and intolerant religious fanaticism that is above all anti-Western. Islamic fundamentalism itself, of course, takes various forms and has a long history extending throughout the modern era. Islamic revivalism and reformism were strong at different times in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the current forms of Islamic radicalism bear distinct similarities to those previous movements. Islamic fundamentalisms are most coherently united, however, in their being resolutely opposed to modernity and modernization. Insofar as political and cultural modernization has been a process of secularization, Islamic fundamentalisms oppose it by posing sacred texts at the center of political constitutions and religious leaders, both priests and jurists, in positions of political power, in terms too of gender roles, family structures, and cultural forms. An unchanging traditional religious norm is commonly meant to stand against the progressively changing secular forms of modernity. Counter to modernism's dynamic and secular society, fundamentalism seems to pose a static and religious one. In this light, then, as an anti-modernism, Islamic fundamentalism seems to be engaged in an effort to reverse the process of social modernization, separate from the global flows of modernity, and recreate a pre-modern world. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, for example, would from this perspective be seen as an anti-revolution, resurrecting an ancient order. Christian fundamentalism in the United States also present themselves as movements against social modernization, recreating what is imagined to be a past social formation based on sacred texts. These movements should certainly be situated in line with the long U.S. tradition of projects to create in America a New Jerusalem, a Christian community separate from both the corruption of Europe and the savagery of the uncivilized world. The most prominent social agenda of the current Christian fundamentalist groups is centered on the recreation of the stable and hierarchical nuclear family, what is imagined to have existed in a previous era, and thus they are driven specifically in their crusades against abortion and homosexuality. Christian fundamentalisms in the United States have also continuously been oriented, in different times and different regions more or less overtly, toward a project of white supremacy and racial purity. The New Jerusalem has almost always been imagined as a white and patriarchal Jerusalem. These common characterizations of fundamentalisms as a return to a pre-modern or traditional world and its social values, however, obscure more than they illuminate. In fact, fundamentalist visions of a return to the past are generally based on historical illusions. The purity and wholesomeness of the stable, nuclear, heterosexual family heralded by Christian fundamentalists, for example, never existed in the United States. The traditional family that serves as their ideological foundation is merely a pastiche of values and practices that derives more from television programs than from any real historical experiences within the institution of the family. It is a fictional image projected in the past, like Main Street, USA at Disneyland, constructed retrospectively through the lens of contemporary anxieties and fears. The return to the traditional family of the Christian fundamentalists is not backward-looking at all, but rather a new invention that is part of a political project against a contemporary social order. Similarly, the current forms of Islamic fundamentalism should not be understood as a return to past social forms and values, not even from the perspective of the practitioners. According to Fawzur Rahman, quote, "Actually, it is even something of a misnomer to call such phenomena in Islam fundamentalist, except insofar as they emphasize the basis of Islam as being the two original sources, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Otherwise, they emphasize ijtihad, original thought." End quote. Contemporary Islamic radicalisms are indeed primarily based on original thought and the invention of original values and practices, which perhaps echo those of other periods of revivalism or fundamentalism, but are really directed in reaction to the present social order. In both cases, then, the fundamentalist return to tradition is really a new invention. The anti-modern thrust that defines fundamentalisms might be better understood then not as a pre-modern but as a post-modern project. The post-modernity of fundamentalism has to be recognized primarily in its refusal of modernity as a weapon of Euro-American hegemony, and in this regard, Islamic fundamentalism is indeed the paradigmatic case. In the context of Islamic traditions, fundamentalism is postmodern insofar as it rejects the tradition of Islamic modernism, for which modernity was always overcoded as assimilation or submission to Euro-American hegemony. Quote, "If modern meant the pursuit of Western education, technology, and industrialization in the first flush of the post-colonial period, postmodern would mean a reversion to traditional Muslim values and a rejection of modernism." End quote, Akbed Ahmed writes. Considered simply in cultural terms, Islamic fundamentalism is a paradoxical kind of postmodernist theory. Postmodern only because it chronologically follows and opposes Islamic modernism. It is more properly postmodernist, however, when considered in geopolitical terms. Rahman writes, quote, "The current postmodernist fundamentalism, in an important way, is novel because its basic elan is anti-Western, hence its condemnation of classical modernism as a purely westernizing force." End quote. Certainly, powerful segments of Islam have been in some sense anti-Western since the religion's inception. What is novel in the contemporary resurgence of fundamentalism is really the refusal of the powers that are emerging in the new imperial order. From this perspective, then, insofar as the Iranian Revolution was a powerful rejection of the world market, we might think of it as a first postmodernist revolution. This marriage between postmodernism and fundamentalism is certainly an odd coupling, considering that postmodernist and fundamentalist discourses stand in most respects in polar opposition. hybridity versus purity, difference versus identity, mobility versus stasis. It seems to us that postmodernists and the current wave of fundamentalists have arisen not only at the same time, but also in response to the same situation, only at opposite poles of the global hierarchy, according to a striking geographical distribution. Simplifying a great deal, one could argue that postmodernist discourses appeal primarily to the winners in the processes of globalization and fundamentalist discourses to the losers. In other words, the current global tendencies toward increased mobility, indeterminacy, and hybridity are experienced by some as a kind of liberation, but by others as an exasperation of their suffering. Certainly, bands of popular support for fundamentalist projects, from the Front National in France and Christian fundamentalism in the United States to the Islamic Brothers, have spread most widely among those who have been further subordinated and excluded by the recent transformation of the global economy and who are most threatened by the increased mobility of capital. The losers in the process of globalization might indeed be the ones who give us the strongest indication of the transformation in progress. The ideology of the world market. Many of the concepts dear to postmodernists and postcolonialists find a perfect correspondence in the current ideology of corporate capital and the world market. The ideology of the world market has always been the anti-foundational and anti-essentialist discourse par excellence. Circulation, mobility, diversity, and mixture are its very conditions of possibility. Trade brings differences together, and the more the merrier. Differences of commodities, populations, cultures, and so forth seem to multiply infinitely in the world market, which attacks nothing more violently than fixed boundaries. It overwhelms any binary division with its infinite multiplicities. As the world market today is realized ever more completely, it tends to deconstruct the boundaries of the nation-state. In a previous period, nation-states are the primary actors in the modern imperialist organization of global production and exchange. But to the world market, they appear increasingly as mere obstacles. Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, is in an excellent position to recognize and celebrate the overcoming of national boundaries in the world market. He contends that, quote, as almost every factor of production, money, technology, factories, and equipment moves effortlessly across borders, the very idea of a national economy is becoming meaningless. In the future, there will be no national products or technologies, no national corporations, no national industries. There will no longer be national economies, at least as we have come to understand that concept. End quote. With the decline of national boundaries, the world market is liberated from the kind of binary divisions that nation-states have imposed. And in this new free space, a myriad of differences appears. These differences, of course, do not play freely across a smooth global space, but rather are regimented in global networks of power consisting of highly differentiated and mobile structures. Arjun Appadore captures the new quality of these structures with the analogy of landscapes, or better, seascapes. In the contemporary world, he sees finance-scapes, technoscapes, ethnoscapes, and so forth. The suffix scape allows us on the one hand to point to the fluidity and irregularity of these various fields, and on the other to indicate formal commonalities among such diverse domains as finance, culture, commodities, and demography. The world market establishes a real politics of difference. The various scapes of the world market provide capital with potentials on a scale previously unimaginable. It should be no surprise then that postmodernist thinking and essential concepts have flourished in the various fields of practice and theory proper to capital, such as marketing, management organization, and the organization of production. Postmodernism is indeed the logic by which global capital operates. Marketing has perhaps the clearest relation to postmodernist theories, and one could even say that the capitalist marketing strategies have long been postmodernist. Avant la lettre. On the other hand, marketing practices and consumer consumption are prime terrain for developing postmodernist thinking. Certain postmodernist theorists, for example, see perpetual shopping and the consumption of commodities and commodified images as the paradigmatic and defining activities of postmodern experience, our collective journeys through hyperreality. On the other hand, postmodernist thinking, with its emphasis on concepts such as difference and multiplicity, is celebration of fetishism and simulacra. Its continual fascination with the new and with fashion is an excellent description of the ideal capitalist schemes of commodity consumption, and thus provides an opportunity to perfect marketing strategies. As a marketing theorist says, there are clear parallels between contemporary market practices and the precepts of postmodernism. Marketing itself is a practice based on differences, and the more differences that are given, the more marketing strategies can develop. Even more hybrid and differentiated populations present a proliferating number of target markets that can each be addressed by specific marketing strategies, one for gay, Latino males between the ages of 18 and 22, another for Chinese American teenage girls, and so forth. Postmodern marketing recognizes the difference of each commodity and each segment of the population, fashioning its strategies accordingly. Every difference is an opportunity. Postmodern marketing practices represent the consumption cycle of contemporary capital, its external face. But we are even more interested in the postmodernist tendencies within the cycle of capitalist production. In the productive sphere, postmodernist thinking has perhaps had the largest direct impact in the field of management and organization theory. Authors in this field argue that large and complex modern organizations, with their rigid boundaries and homogeneous units, are not adequate for doing business in the postmodern world. The postmodern organization, one theorist writes, has certain distinctive features, notably an emphasis on small to moderate size and complexity and adoption of flexible structures and modes of interinstitutional cooperation to meet turbulent organizational and environmental conditions. Postmodern organizations are thus imagined either as located on the boundaries between different systems and cultures or as internally hybrid. What is essential for postmodern management is that organizations be mobile, flexible, and able to deal with difference. Here, postmodernist theories pave the way for the transformation of the internal structures of capitalist organizations. The culture within these organizations has also adopted the precepts of postmodernist thinking. The great transnational corporations that straddle national boundaries and link the global system are themselves internally much more diverse and fluid culturally than the parochial modern corporations of previous years. The contemporary gurus of corporate culture, who are employed by management as consultants and strategy planners, preach the efficiency and profitability of diversity and multiculturalism within corporations. When one looks closely at U.S. corporate ideology, and to a lesser but still significant extent, at U.S. corporate practice, it is clear that corporations do not operate simply by excluding the gendered and/or racialized other. In fact, the old modernist forms of racist and sexist theory are the explicit enemies of this new corporate culture. The corporation seeks to include difference within their realm, and thus aim to maximize creativity, free play, and diversity in the corporate workplace. People of all different races, sexes, and sexual orientations should potentially be included in the corporation. The daily routine of the workplace should be rejuvenated with unexpected changes and an atmosphere of fun. Break down the old boundaries and let 100 flowers bloom. The task of the boss, subsequently, is to organize these energies and differences in the interest of profit. This project is aptly called diversity management. In this light, the corporations appear not only progressive, but also postmodernist, as leaders in a very real politics of difference. The production processes of capital have also taken forms that echo postmodernist projects. We will have ample opportunity to analyze, particularly in section 3.4, how production has come to be organized in flexible and hybrid networks. This is, in our view, the most important respect in which the contemporary transformation of capital in the world market constitute a real process of postmodernization. We certainly agree with those contemporary theorists such as David Harvey and Friedrich Jameson, who see postmodernity as a new phase of capital's accumulation and commodification that accompanies a contemporary realization of the world market. The global politics of difference established by the world market is defined not by free play and equality, but by the imposition of new hierarchies, or really by a constant process of hierarchization. Postmodernist and postcolonialist theories, and fundamentalisms in a very different way, are really sentinels that signal this passage and course. In this regard, are indispensable. Truth commissions. It is salutary to remind ourselves that postmodernist and postcolonial discourses are effective only in very specific geographical locations and among a certain class of the population. As a political discourse, postmodernism has a certain currency in Europe, Japan, and Latin America, but its primary site of application is within an elite segment of the U.S. intelligentsia. Similarly, the post-colonial theory that shares certain postmodernist tendencies have been developed primarily among a cosmopolitan set that moves among the metropolises and major universities of Europe and the United States. This specificity does not invalidate the theoretical perspectives, but it should make us pause for a moment to reflect on their political implications and practical effects. Numerous genuinely progressive and liberatory discourses have emerged throughout history among elite groups, and we have no intention here of questioning the vocation of such theorizing to court. More important than the specificity of these theorists are the resonances their concepts stimulate in different geographical and class locations. Certainly from the standpoint of many around the world, hybridity, mobility, and difference do not immediately appear as liberatory in themselves. Huge populations see mobility as an aspect of their suffering because they are displaced at an increasing speed in dire circumstances. For several decades as part of the modernization process, there have been massive migrations from rural areas to metropolitan centers within each country and across the globe. The international flow of labor has only increased in recent years, not only from south to north, in the form of legal and illegal guest workers or immigrants, but also from south to south, that is, the temporary or semi-permanent worker migrations among southern regions, such as that of South Asian workers in the Persian Gulf. Even these massive worker migrations, however, are dwarfed in terms of numbers and misery by those forced from their homes and land by famine and war. Just a cursory glance around the world, from Central America to Central Africa, and from the Balkans to Southeast Asia, will reveal the desperate plight of those on whom such mobility has been imposed. For them, mobility across boundaries often amounts to forced migration and poverty, and is hardly liberatory. In fact, a stable and defined place in which to live, a certain immobility, can on the contrary appear as the most urgent need. The postmodernist epistemological challenge to the Enlightenment, its attack on master narratives and its critique of truth, also loses its liberatory aura when transposed outside the elite intellectual strata of Europe and North America. Consider, for example, the mandate of the Truth Commission formed at the end of the Civil War in El Salvador, or the similar institutions that have been established in the post-dictatorial and post-authoritarian regimes of Latin America and South Africa. In the context of state terror and mystification, clinging to the primacy of the concept of truth can be a powerful and necessary form of resistance. Establishing and making public the truth of the recent past, attributing responsibility to state officials for specific acts, and in some cases, exacting retribution, appears here as the ineluctable precondition for any democratic future. The master narratives of the Enlightenment do not seem particularly oppressive here, and the concept of truth is not fluid or unstable. On the contrary, the truth is that this general ordered the torture and assassination of that Union leader, and this colonel led the massacre of that village. Making public such truths is an exemplary Enlightenment project of modernist politics, and the critique of it in these contexts could serve only to aid the mystification and repressive powers of the regime under attack. In our present imperial world, the liberatory potential of the postmodernist and post-colonial discourses that we have described only resonates with the situation of an elite population that enjoys certain rights, a certain level of wealth, and a certain position in the global hierarchy. One should not take this recognition, however, as a complete refutation. It is not really a matter of either or. Difference, hybridity, and mobility are not liberatory in themselves, but neither are truth, purity, and stasis. The real revolutionary practice refers to the level of production. Truth will not make us free, but taking control of the production of truth will. Mobility and hybridity are not liberatory, but taking control of the production, mobility, and stasis, purities, and mixtures is. The truth commissions of empire will be constituent assemblies in the multitude, social factories for the production of truth. The poor. In each and every historical period, a social subject that is ever present and everywhere the same is identified, often negatively, but nonetheless urgently, around a common living form. This form is not that of the powerful and the rich, They are merely partial and localized figures, quantitate signate. The only non-localizable common name of pure difference in all eras is that of the poor. The poor is destitute, excluded, repressed, exploited, and yet living. It is a common denominator of life, the foundation of the multitude. It is strange but also illuminating that postmodernist authors seldom adopt this figure in their theorizing. It is strange because the poor is, in a certain respect, an eternal postmodern figure, the figure of a transversal, omnipresent, different, mobile subject, the testament to the irrepressive, aleatory character of existence. This common name, the poor, is also the foundation of every possibility of humanity. As Niccolo Machiavelli pointed out, in the Return to Beginnings that characterizes the revolutionary phase of the religions and ideologies of modernity, the poor is almost always seen to have a prophetic capacity. Not only is the poor in the world, but the poor itself is the very possibility of the world. Only the poor lives radically the actual and present being, in destitution and suffering, and thus only the poor has the ability to renew being. The divinity of the multitude of the poor does not point to any transcendence. On the contrary, here and only here, in this world, in the existence of the poor, is a field of immanence presented, confirmed, consolidated, and opened. The poor is the God on earth. Today there is not even the illusion of a transcendent God. The poor has dissolved that image and recuperated its power. Long ago, modernity was inaugurated with Orbella's laugh, with a realistic supremacy of the belly of the poor, with a poetics that expresses all that there is in destitute humanity from the belt on down. Later, through the process of primitive accumulation, the proletariat emerged as a collective subject that could express itself in materiality and immanence, a multitude of poor that not only prophesied but produced, and that thus opened possibilities that were not virtual but concrete. Finally today, in the biopolitical regimes of production and the processes of postmodernization, the poor is a subjugated, exploited figure, but nonetheless a figure of production. This is where the novelty lies. Everywhere today, at the basis of the concept and the common name of the poor, there is a relationship of production. Why are the postmodernists unable to read this passage? They tell us that a regime of transversal linguistic relations of production has entered into the unified and abstract universe of value. But who is the subject that produces transversally? Who gives a creative meaning to language? Who, if not the poor, who are subjugated and desiring, impoverished and powerful, always more powerful? Here within this reign of global production, the poor is distinguished no longer only by its prophetic capacity, but also by its indispensable presence in the production of a common wealth, always more exploited and always more closely indexed to the wages of rule. The poor itself is power. There is world poverty, and there is above all world possibility. And only the poor is capable of this. Vogelfrei, bird free, is a term Marx used to describe the proletariat, which at the beginning of modernity in the processes of primitive accumulation was freed twice over. In the first place, it was freed from being the property of the master, that is, freed from servitude. And in the second place, it was freed from the means of production, separated from the soil with nothing to sell but its own labor power. In this sense, the proletariat was forced to become the pure possibility of wealth. The dominant stream of the Marxist tradition, however, has always hated the poor, precisely for their being free as birds, for being immune to the discipline of the factory and the discipline necessary for the construction of socialism. Consider how, when in the early 1950s, Vittorio De Sica and Cesare Zavattini set the poor to fly away on broomsticks at the end of their beautiful film Miracle in Milan. They were so violently denounced for utopianism by the spokesman of socialist realism. The Vogelfrei is an angel or an intractable demon. And here, after so many attempts to transform the poor into proletarians and proletarians into a liberation army, the idea of army weighed heavily on that of liberation. Once again in postmodernity, emerges in the blinding light of clear day the multitude, the common name of the poor. It comes out fully in the open because in postmodernity, the subjugated has absorbed the exploited. In other words, the poor, every poor person, the multitude of poor people have eaten up and digested the multitude of proletarians. By that fact itself, the poor have become productive. Even the prostituted body, the destituted person, the hunger of the multitude, all forms of the poor have become productive, and the poor have therefore become ever more important. The life of the poor invests the planet and envelops it with its desire for creativity and freedom. The poor is a condition for every production. The story goes that the root of the postmodernist sensibility and the construction of the concept of postmodernism are those French socialist philosophers who in their youth celebrated factory discipline and the shining horizons of real socialism, but who became repentant after the crisis of 1968 and gave up, proclaiming the futility of the pretense of communism to reappropriate social wealth. Today, these same philosophers cynically deconstruct, banalize, and laugh at every social struggle that contests the universal triumph of exchange value. The media and the culture of the media tell us that those philosophers are the ones who recognize this new era of the world, but that is not true. The discovery of postmodernity consisted in the reproposition of the poor at the center of the political and productive terrain. What was really prophetic was the poor, bird-free laugh of Charlie Chaplin, when, free from any utopian illusions, and above all from any discipline of liberation, he interpreted the modern times of poverty, but at the same time linked the name of the poor to that of life, a liberated life, and a liberated productivity.